No maid looks better than me! No maid looks better than me!
The mansion sat on 11 acres of manicured lawn overlooking the Hudson River, a pale limestone palace with 42 rooms and a ballroom, whose ceiling had been painted by an artist flown in from Florence 3 decades earlier. On the night of the engagement party, chandeliers dripped golden light across marble floors, polished to a mirror shine, and hundreds of guests in silk and tailored wool moved through the rooms like a river of quiet money. Somewhere beneath all that glittering surface, in a small room off the kitchen pantry, a woman named Maya Whitfield pressed her palm flat against a starched black uniform and reminded herself, as she did every morning, that dignity was not something anyone else could hand her. And it was not something anyone else could take away either. She had no idea, standing there in the dim light with the scent of lilies drifting in from the corridor, that within 4 hours everything about her life would be different, or that the man who would walk through those doors and change it all had been searching for her for nearly 9 years. Maya had come to the Sinclair estate almost 6 years earlier, hired quietly through a domestic staffing agency after a woman named Eleanor Sinclair, the family matriarch, had taken one look at her resume and decided she liked the steadiness in Maya's eyes more than the gaps in her employment history. Eleanor was 81 then, sharp-tongued and lonely in the way that very wealthy old women often are, surrounded by relatives who visited only when they needed something signed. Maya arrived to clean and cook and manage the household staff. But somewhere in the first winter, she began reading to Eleanor in the evenings, and somewhere in the second winter, Eleanor began calling her by name instead of ringing a bell. Nobody else in that family ever bothered to notice the change. To them, Maya was simply part of the furniture, present but invisible, the way a marble column is present in a room, without anyone ever thinking to ask how it got there, or what it might be holding up. She was always the first person awake in that house, moving through the kitchen before 5 in the morning to start the coffee and iron the day's linens, and she was always the last to sleep, checking that every door was locked and every light was off long after the family had gone to bed. 6 years of early mornings and late nights had taught her the exact creak of every floorboard on the second landing, the specific way sunlight fell across the east parlor at 4 in the afternoon, and the particular silence of a house full of people who had never once asked how she was doing. Nobody at the Sinclair estate remembered her birthday. Nobody had ever asked where she grew up, or whether she had family, or what she dreamed about at night. To the guests who passed through those halls year after year, she was simply the Black Maid, a phrase spoken without malice most of the time, which somehow made it worse, because it meant they had never even considered that she might have a name at all. Some of the guests treated her with the careless cruelty of people who had never been told no in their entire lives. There was a banker's wife who once knocked a full glass of red wine onto a white rug simply to watch Maya get down on her knees and scrub it out, laughing softly to her friends the entire time, as though it were a magic trick performed for her amusement. There was a young heir who liked to ring the service bell at 2 in the morning for a glass of water he never drank, just to prove that he could. Maya absorbed all of it the way a stone absorbs rain, without complaint, without visible cracking, because she had decided long ago that her dignity did not live in other people's hands, and she was not going to hand it over just because someone demanded it. Still, the housekeeper, a soft-spoken older woman named Ruth Patterson, who had worked in that house even longer than Maya, sometimes watched her with worried eyes. One evening, after a particularly humiliating dinner service, where a guest had snapped his fingers at her twice as though she were a dog, Ruth found Maya alone in the pantry, quietly stacking dishes, with hands that trembled just slightly more than usual. Ruth set down her own tray and asked the question she had been holding back for years, the question that had been forming in her mind every time she watched Maya swallow another insult without a single word of protest. She asked her gently why she stayed, why a woman with Maya's intelligence and grace kept returning to a house that treated her as though she were invisible, when there were surely other households, other cities, other lives, waiting somewhere beyond that iron gate. Maya set down the plate she was holding, looked at the older woman, with a calm that seemed to come from somewhere very deep, and said only that she still had a promise left to keep, one that mattered more than her own comfort, and that she intended to see it through, no matter what it cost her. Ruth did not press further that night, but she never forgot the way Maya's voice had softened when she said the word promise, as though it were something sacred she was carrying alone. The woman at the center of the engagement being celebrated that night was named Sophia Vance, 26 years old, the only daughter of a real estate developer whose fortune had been built on decades of aggressive acquisitions across 3 states. Sophia had grown up believing that the world existed to admire her, and for the most part, the world had cooperated. She was beautiful in the sharp, curated way that expensive stylists and personal trainers can produce, and she had learned early that beauty combined with money could open almost any door she wanted opened. She was engaged to Ethan Sinclair, heir to the family that owned the estate, a pleasant enough young man who had spent his entire life being told that he was destined for greatness simply because of the name he carried, and who had never developed the backbone to question anything his fiancée said or did. From the very first afternoon, Sophia visited the estate as Ethan's intended. Something about Maya unsettled her in a way she could not quite name. It was not that Maya was disrespectful, because she never once raised her voice or refused an instruction. It was something quieter and more infuriating than that. A stillness in Maya's posture, a level gaze that never dropped in the way Sophia expected servants' eyes to drop. Sophia had spent her whole life surrounded by people who flattered her, who laughed a half-second before her jokes even landed, who scrambled to agree with whatever she said, and Maya simply did none of that. She was polite, efficient, and utterly unmoved by Sophia's presence, and to a woman who measured her own worth by the reactions she provoked in others, that indifference felt like a personal insult. So, Sophia began testing her, the way a child pokes at something just to see if it will react. She would order Maya to reheat a coffee 3 times because the temperature was never quite right. She would deliberately step in mud before entering the house and demand that Maya kneel down to clean her designer heels in front of whoever happened to be standing nearby. Once, she poured an entire glass of sparkling water down the front of Maya's freshly pressed uniform, simply because Maya had answered a question a half-second slower than Sophia wanted, and then she smiled sweetly and asked whether Maya needed help finding a mirror. Every single time, Maya's response was the same 2 words, spoken without inflection, without anger, without the faintest crack in her composure. She apologized, and then she cleaned up whatever mess had been made, and she moved on to the next task as though nothing had happened at all. That composure, more than anything else, was what began to eat away at Sophia, because she wanted tears, she wanted a broken voice, she wanted some visible proof that she had power over another human being, and Maya refused, again and again, to give it to her. The night of the engagement party had been planned for 8 months, orchestrated down to the smallest detail by a team of event planners flown in from Manhattan. 300 guests filled the ballroom and spilled out onto the terrace overlooking the river, among them senators, hedge fund managers, newspaper columnists, and the kind of old money families whose names appeared on hospital wings and university libraries. Sophia had chosen every flower, every candle, every note of music, because this night was not simply a celebration of her engagement. It was, in her mind, a coronation, a public announcement to the entire city that she had arrived, that she now belonged among the families whose names carried weight simply by being spoken aloud. She spent the early part of the evening moving from cluster to cluster of important guests, her laughter a little too bright, her hand resting a little too possessively on Ethan's arm, making certain that everyone in the room understood exactly who was about to become the newest Sinclair. She ordered Maya to circulate with a specific silver tray of champagne, then changed her mind and demanded a different tray entirely, then sent her back to the kitchen for a 3rd time because the ice in the champagne bucket had, in Sophia's estimation, begun to melt too quickly. Each command was delivered a little louder than necessary, a little more theatrically, as though Sophia wanted the surrounding guests to witness her authority over the household staff, to see her command obedience, the way she imagined a true society matriarch should. Throughout that first hour of the party, the household staff moved through the crowd like a current beneath the surface of a lake, visible only in flashes, present in every glass refilled and every canapé replaced, yet somehow never quite seen by the guests they served. Waiters in matching black vests navigated between clusters of laughter, with silver trays balanced overhead, and among them, Maya moved with a particular grace born of 6 years of practice, anticipating which table needed attention before anyone had to ask, catching a toppling centerpiece before it could fall, guiding a slightly intoxicated guest gently away from the open terrace doors, without ever drawing attention to the small kindness. A handful of the older guests, the ones who had visited the estate often enough over the years to recognize a familiar face, occasionally nodded politely in her direction, though even they rarely bothered to learn her name. Most simply saw the uniform and looked past the woman wearing it, the way people look past a lamppost or a fire hydrant, useful only in the abstract, never worth a second glance. It was an older gentleman near the dessert table, a retired judge with silver hair and kind eyes, who unknowingly set the evening's tragedy into motion. As Maya leaned down to refill his glass, he glanced up and offered an offhand compliment, the kind of small courtesy that most people forget the instant it leaves their mouth. He told her, quite simply, that her hair was lovely, thick and dark and beautifully, kept despite the long hours she must be working. It was nothing, really, just an old man being kind to a young woman who had shown him patience all evening. But Sophia was standing close enough to hear it, and something in her chest tightened at the sound of a compliment being given, unprompted, to the maid, on the very night that was supposed to belong entirely to her. For the rest of the hour, Sophia could not stop replaying that single sentence in her mind. Her hair is lovely. The words followed her, from conversation to conversation, gnawing at something raw and unexamined in her, some old wound about attention and belonging that had nothing at all to do with Maya, and everything to do with a lifetime of needing to be the most admired person in every room she entered. By the time she found herself near the bar, with 2 glasses of champagne already gone, that small ember of jealousy had grown into something uglier, something that wanted an audience and wanted, more than anything, to reclaim the spotlight that a stranger's careless compliment had, in Sophia's mind, stolen away from her. She spotted Maya near the grand staircase, carrying a tray of empty glasses toward the kitchen, and something in her decided, in that instant, that tonight would be the night she finally broke this woman's maddening composure once and for all. She crossed the ballroom floor with quick, deliberate steps, her heels striking the marble like small hammers, and the nearby conversations quieted slightly as guests noticed the tension radiating from her posture. She reached the small sewing station that the event staff had set up near the coat room for last-minute alterations, and her hand closed around a pair of silver fabric scissors resting on the table, the kind used to trim loose threads from tablecloths and drapery. What happened next unfolded in front of nearly 40 witnesses, though later, when questioned, several of them would claim they had looked away too quickly to say for certain what they saw, too uncomfortable with their own inaction to admit they had simply stood there and watched. Sophia walked directly up to Maya, seized a thick handful of her hair, before Maya even had time to register what was happening, and dragged her several feet toward the center of the grand foyer, where the light from the chandelier was brightest, and the largest cluster of guests happened to be standing. She raised her voice, loud enough to be heard over the string quartet, and announced to the room that a servant had no business looking prettier than the woman who owned the house she worked in. Then, before anyone could move, before anyone could easily process the words she had just spoken, she brought the scissors up and cut. The sound of the blades closing through hair was somehow louder than it should have been, a dry, decisive snip that seemed to silence every other noise in the room at once. A thick lock of dark hair fell to the marble floor, and Sophia cut again and again, working with the frantic energy of someone who had crossed a line and could not stop herself from crossing further, as though continuing the act might somehow justify having started it. Guests gasped. Somewhere near the bar, a glass shattered against the floor as someone's hand went slack with shock. A woman near the staircase pressed both hands over her mouth. Nobody stepped forward to stop her. 300 of the wealthiest, most educated, most socially prominent people in the city stood frozen in place, and not a single one of them moved to pull the scissors away. Maya did not scream. She did not fight back or try to twist free of Sophia's grip. When the last uneven lock fell to the floor and Sophia finally released her, stepping back with the scissors still trembling in her hand and her chest heaving with something that looked almost like triumph, Maya simply lowered herself to her knees on the cold marble and began, quietly and methodically, to gather the fallen strands of her own hair into her palm. A thin line of blood had appeared at her scalp where the blade had caught skin along with hair, a small crimson thread trailing down toward her ear, and still she said nothing. She did not look up at Sophia. She did not look for sympathy in the faces surrounding her. She simply knelt there in her ruined black uniform, gathering the pieces of herself off a stranger's floor, and the silence of her grief was somehow more unbearable to witness than screaming would have been. Sophia, flushed with the strange high of having finally provoked a visible reaction, however quiet, turned to survey the crowd as though waiting for applause, for validation, for someone to tell her she had been justified. Instead, she found only stunned, uncertain faces, the kind of expressions people wear when they have witnessed something they know is wrong, but do not yet understand the scale of what it will cost. Ethan stood a few feet away, his champagne glass still raised halfway to his lips, his mouth slightly open, apparently too shocked or too cowardly to say a single word in his fiancée's defense, or against her. The string quartet, uncertain whether to continue, let their bows drift into silence, and for a long, strange moment, the only sound in that enormous room was the faint, wet sniff of Maya breathing carefully through the pain, refusing to let it become a sob. It was into that silence, precisely into that frozen, guilty stillness, that the sound of engines rolling up the long gravel drive first became audible through the open terrace doors. Headlights swept briefly across the tall windows of the ballroom, and several guests near the front turned instinctively toward the sound, grateful for any distraction from the horror they had just witnessed and failed to prevent. A black Rolls-Royce eased to a stop directly in front of the main entrance, followed by 2 additional vehicles, and from each of them stepped men in dark suits who moved with the practiced discipline of professional security rather than ordinary chauffeurs. Whispers rippled backward through the crowd almost instantly, because in certain circles, that particular fleet of vehicles needed no introduction at all. The man who stepped out of the Rolls-Royce was Daniel Whitfield, 44 years old, one of the wealthiest investors in the country, a man whose name appeared regularly on the covers of business magazines and whose signature alone could move markets. He had not been on the guest list. Nobody had sent him an invitation, and nobody in the Sinclair family had any idea why he would choose to appear, uninvited, at their son's engagement celebration. He walked through the front doors with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once needed to explain himself to anyone, his security detail fanning out discreetly behind him, and it took only a few steps into the foyer before his gaze landed on the scene in the center of the marble floor. Everything about his expression changed in the span of a single breath. The polite, unreadable composure he wore in every boardroom and every photograph dissolved instantly, replaced by something raw and furious that made even his own security team take an involuntary step backward. He saw the scattered locks of dark hair across the marble. He saw the thin trickle of blood at Maya's hairline. He saw her kneeling there, gathering pieces of herself with steady, careful hands, refusing to let a room full of strangers see her break. And in that instant, Daniel Whitfield recognized her completely. Though 6 years had passed and she was wearing a uniform he had never seen her in before, though the room around her was filled with people who had no idea what her face meant to him, he crossed the foyer in long, deliberate strides, ignoring the dozens of stunned faces turning toward him, ignoring Ethan Sinclair's father, already hurrying forward with an outstretched hand and a rehearsed smile of welcome. He knelt down directly in front of Maya, heedless of his tailored suit against the cold marble floor, and for a moment the two of them simply looked at each other, the noise of the party fading into something distant and unimportant around them. Then he turned his head, slowly, and looked up at the crowd surrounding them. His voice, when it finally came, low and controlled in a way that was far more frightening than shouting would have been. He asked a single question, 4 words that seemed to hang in the air and settle over every guest in that room like a physical weight. Who did this to her? Nobody answered. Sophia, still holding the scissors loosely at her side, felt the blood drain from her face as 300 pairs of eyes shifted, almost in unison, away from her and toward the floor, toward their own shoes, toward anywhere that was not her guilty expression. Ethan's mother let out a small, strangled sound. The host of the party, a man who had built an empire on always knowing exactly what to say in any social situation, found himself utterly speechless, because he understood, in that instant, precisely how much danger had just walked through his front door. Daniel Whitfield was not simply a wealthy stranger who happened to wander in. He was the single largest investor behind 2 of the family's most critical business ventures, the man whose continued partnership determined whether an entire tower of financial deals would stand or collapse, and he had just watched their future daughter-in-law mutilate a woman on their marble floor. What none of them yet understood, what would only become clear over the following hour as the true story unraveled in whispers and then in open explanation, was that Daniel Whitfield's connection to Maya went back nearly a decade, to a time in his life when he had possessed nothing at all resembling the empire that now bore his name. 9 years earlier, before the private jets and the towers with his name etched into their lobbies, Daniel had been a 35-year-old man watching his first company collapse beneath the weight of a failed investment. Evicted from his apartment with barely enough cash to cover a week of meals, sleeping some nights in his car because he could not bring himself to call his family and admit how completely he had failed. He had been, in every sense that mattered on paper, nobody, a man the world had already begun to forget. He had been sitting on a bench outside a small diner in Queens, on one of the coldest nights of that winter, having just been turned away from a shelter that had already reached capacity, when a young woman working the late shift at the diner noticed him through the window and brought out a plate of food he had not ordered and could not pay for. That woman was Maya, 21 years old at the time, working double shifts to support herself, while saving toward a nursing degree she would eventually have to abandon when her own family's medical bills consumed every dollar she had set aside. She did not know his name that night, did not know anything about the empire he had lost or the one he would eventually build. She simply saw a man who looked hungry and cold and alone, and she gave him a meal, and when the diner closed for the night, she quietly handed him enough cash from her own tip jar to cover a bus fare and a motel room, refusing to take no for an answer, telling him simply that everyone deserved one night of warmth, no matter how bad things looked. In the weeks that followed that first meeting, Daniel had rebuilt himself slowly, one modest contract at a time, sleeping on a friend's couch and taking freelance consulting work that paid barely enough to cover groceries. But he never forgot the particular quality of kindness Maya had shown him that night, kindness offered without any expectation of return, given freely to a stranger who had nothing to offer in exchange but gratitude. It became, over time, a kind of private compass for him, a memory he returned to whenever a business decision tempted him toward the same casual cruelty he had witnessed so often among men who had forgotten what it felt like to have nothing. Colleagues who worked with him in later years often remarked, without quite understanding why, that Daniel Whitfield treated every employee, from junior analysts to the custodial staff who cleaned his offices at night, with a level of genuine respect that seemed almost old-fashioned in an industry built on hierarchy and status. Few of them ever learned the reason behind it, because Daniel rarely spoke of that winter in Queens, holding the memory close and private, a debt he intended to repay in full the moment fate allowed him the chance. Daniel had tried, over the following weeks, to find some way to repay her, but by the time he scraped enough money together to return to that diner, she had already left the job, and the trail went cold. He never forgot her face, never forgot the exact words she had used that night, and as his fortunes slowly turned and multiplied over the following years, the memory of that unpaid debt had followed him everywhere, a quiet, persistent thread of gratitude he had never been able to properly close. He had hired investigators more than once over the years, following faint leads that never quite led anywhere solid. and he had all but resigned himself to never being able to find her again, until, purely by chance, a business associate mentioned in passing that the Sinclair family's household staff included a remarkably capable woman named Maya, who had transformed the running of their estate. Something about the name had struck him immediately, and he had accepted the invitation to a preliminary business dinner at the estate 2 weeks earlier, specifically to catch a glimpse of her, to confirm whether fate had finally handed him the chance he had waited 9 years for. He had seen her that evening from a distance, across a crowded room, and confirmed everything he needed to know without ever approaching her, choosing instead to wait for a moment when he could speak with her properly, privately, without an audience turning the reunion into a spectacle. Tonight had been meant to be that moment. He had arrived at the engagement party uninvited specifically because he had learned, through a brief and unremarkable phone call earlier that afternoon, that Maya would be working the event, and he had wanted finally, after 9 long years, to walk up to her quietly and thank her properly for a kindness that had changed the entire trajectory of his life. He had never imagined he would arrive to find her kneeling on a marble floor, bleeding, surrounded by the very people who owed her the most and had given her the least. Once the story began to surface, first in halting explanations from Daniel himself, and then in the increasingly panicked confirmations of Ethan's parents, who realized with sickening speed exactly how much they stood to lose, the mood of the party shifted entirely. The host called for the estate's security footage to be pulled immediately, and within 20 minutes, a laptop had been set up near the foyer. The footage projected onto a nearby screen, originally intended for the evening's slideshow of the happy couple. The recording left no room for doubt or excuse. Every guest in that ballroom watched Sophia cross the floor with deliberate purpose, watched her seize Maya's hair, watched the scissors rise and fall, watched her smile afterward, as though she had accomplished something worth celebrating. There was no ambiguity left to hide behind, no version of events that could be softened or explained away as an accident or a misunderstanding. Daniel Whitfield rose to his feet slowly, his hand still resting protectively on Maya's shoulder, and addressed the room in a voice that carried effortlessly to every corner of the ballroom, without ever rising into a shout. He reminded everyone present, in case they had somehow forgotten, that his firm currently held controlling stakes in 2 of the largest developments the Sinclair family had underway, developments that together represented several $billion in projected value and thousands of jobs across 3 cities. He told them plainly, without theatrics, that he had no interest whatsoever in continuing any business relationship of any kind with a family that had stood in a room and watched a woman be mutilated without a single person lifting a hand to stop it. He said that a person capable of that particular brand of cruelty in public would never be welcomed into any family he had influence over, and that included, effective immediately, any family bearing the Sinclair name. The reaction rippled through the crowd almost instantaneously, because everyone present understood exactly what those words meant in practical terms. 2 of the investment partners who had been quietly celebrating their inclusion in the evening's guest list were already exchanging glances, already calculating how quickly they needed to distance themselves before their own names became associated with the unfolding scandal. A journalist who had been covering the party for a society column had been recording portions of the confrontation on her phone since the moment the scissors first appeared, and by midnight, clips of the footage, obtained through channels nobody could quite trace, had already begun circulating far beyond the walls of that ballroom. Sophia's composure, which had carried her through a lifetime of getting exactly what she wanted, finally shattered completely. She dropped to her knees in the middle of the foyer, the scissors clattering uselessly against the marble, and began pleading, first with Daniel, and then with Ethan's parents, insisting that she had simply lost her temper for a moment, that it meant nothing, that surely everyone present had done something regrettable at some point, that did not deserve to define their entire future. Nobody in that room offered her the comfort of agreement. The evidence sat glowing on the screen behind her, undeniable and unedited, and no amount of pleading could rewrite what 300 people had already watched happen with their own eyes. Ethan's father, a man who had spent his entire career cultivating an image of unshakable authority, spent the remainder of that night making increasingly desperate phone calls from his study, trying to reach every board member and partner he could think of before the story had a chance to spread further than the confines of that ballroom. It was already too late. One of the catering staff, shaken by what she had witnessed, had quietly called her sister on the drive home, and by the time the sun rose over the Hudson, versions of the story, some accurate and some wildly exaggerated, were already circulating among people who had never set foot inside that house. Ethan himself retreated to a guest room upstairs, rather than face his own family, sitting alone in the dark for hours. Replaying the moment, he had stood frozen with a champagne glass in his hand, instead of stepping forward to stop the woman he claimed to love from committing an act of casual violence in front of hundreds of witnesses. He would later admit, in a private conversation with his mother, that his silence in that moment had frightened him more than anything Sophia had done, because it had shown him, with brutal clarity, exactly what kind of man he had allowed himself to become inside that family's gilded expectations. By the following morning, the fallout had accelerated far beyond anything Sophia's family could contain. The footage, now viewed by an audience far larger than the party itself had ever included, prompted immediate statements from two of the corporate boards connected to Sophia's father's real estate ventures, both distancing themselves publicly from any association with his company pending further review. Daniel Whitfield's firm issued a brief, carefully worded statement confirming that all pending investment agreements with the Sinclair family's current projects had been formally suspended. Within 72 hours, 3 separate business partners who had spent years cultivating relationships with the Sinclair name quietly withdrew their support, unwilling to be seen standing anywhere near a scandal that had already claimed so much public attention. The engagement, unsurprisingly, was called off within the same week, announced through a terse press release that mentioned nothing of scissors or marble floors, though by then, everyone who mattered already knew exactly why. What surprised almost everyone who had spent the previous 6 years dismissing Maya as simply the household help was the discovery, in the days that followed, of exactly how deliberately she had chosen the life she was living. She had not stayed at the Sinclair estate out of desperation or lack of options, as most of them had assumed without ever bothering to ask. In the months after the incident, as reporters dug for details to fill out the story that had captured public attention, they learned that Maya had, in fact, turned down at least 3 more comfortable positions over the past several years, including one offer from a family friend of Daniel's own circle that would have paid nearly triple her current salary. She had turned them all down for a single reason that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with a promise she had made years earlier to a dying woman who had shown her more genuine kindness than almost anyone else in her adult life. That woman had been Eleanor Sinclair, the family matriarch who had originally hired her, and in her final year of life, weakened by illness, and increasingly aware that her own family visited her out of obligation rather than affection, Eleanor had asked Maya for one thing before she passed. She had asked her to stay, to keep the household running exactly as it always had, to preserve the character and the memory of the home Eleanor had built over 60 years of marriage and motherhood, at least until the estate had passed properly into the next generation and no longer needed the steady hand that had kept it functioning through Eleanor's final, difficult months. Maya had promised her that she would, and in the years since Eleanor's death, she had kept that promise with a quiet, unwavering discipline that none of Eleanor's own children or grandchildren had ever managed to notice or appreciate. The promise, as it happened, had only recently reached its natural conclusion, with the estate's ownership finally settling, and the household transition complete, which meant that on the very night everything fell apart in that ballroom, Maya had, without anyone realizing it, already fulfilled the last obligation tying her to that house. Daniel found her 3 days after the party, sitting quietly on a bench in the estate's rear garden, the same kind of ordinary wooden bench where he had once sat freezing and forgotten outside a diner in Queens 9 years earlier. He sat down beside her without asking permission, the way old friends do, and for a long while neither of them said anything at all, simply watching the late afternoon light settle over the river beyond the property line. Eventually he asked her the question that had been building in him since the moment he recognized her kneeling on that marble floor asking whether she might want to leave this place now, whether the promise that had held her there for so long had finally, at long last, been paid in full. Maya turned and looked back at the house one final time, taking in the tall windows and the ivy climbing along the east wall. 6 years of memory folded into a single long glance, and then she looked at Daniel and nodded slowly, telling him simply that, yes, she was ready, that it was time. She walked out through the estate's front gate, 2 weeks later for the final time, no longer wearing the black uniform that had defined how 300 strangers once saw her, dressed instead in a simple gray coat that belonged entirely to her, chosen entirely by her own hand. For the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, she walked with her chin lifted, unhurried, unafraid of who might be watching or what they might think of her. Daniel had offered her, in the weeks following the incident, an opportunity that had nothing to do with charity and everything to do with genuine respect for what she had built within herself, despite years of being treated as though she barely existed. He asked her to lead a new foundation his firm was establishing, one dedicated entirely to supporting domestic workers, hospitality staff, and low-wage employees who had experienced discrimination or mistreatment in the course of their work, with real funding behind it and real authority to shape how that funding was used. Maya accepted, not out of any desire for revenge against Sophia or the Sinclair family, but because she recognized, in the offer, a chance to make certain that no other woman would have to kneel silently on a stranger's floor, gathering the pieces of her own dignity, while 300 people watched and did nothing. She never once, in any of the interviews that eventually followed her rising public profile, spoke Sophia's name with bitterness, or asked for any form of punishment beyond what the consequences had already delivered on their own. When a reporter finally asked her directly, months later, how she felt about everything that had happened that night, Maya considered the question carefully before answering, and then told her, simply, that the worst part of that evening had never been the loss of her hair at all, because hair grows back given enough patience and enough time. The truly devastating part, she said, had been watching an entire room full of educated, wealthy, capable people choose silence over decency, and that was the wound she hoped her new work might slowly begin to heal, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever stood exactly where she once stood. Sophia's life, in the months following the party, unraveled with a speed that surprised even people who had disliked her for years. Her engagement gone, her family's business relationships collapsing one by one under the weight of withdrawn partnerships, she found herself increasingly excluded from the very social circles she had spent her entire adult life working to dominate. Invitations stopped arriving. Old friends grew suddenly busy whenever she called. Her father's company, already weakened by the loss of Daniel Whitfield's investment, struggled through a difficult year of restructuring, and Sophia herself eventually left the city altogether, moving to a smaller town upstate, where fewer people recognized her face from the footage that had, for a time, seemed to be everywhere at once. She was rarely mentioned again in the circles she once ruled, that her name slowly fading from relevance the way names often do once the scandal that made them famous stops being interesting to anyone. Ruth Patterson, the housekeeper who had once quietly asked Maya why she stayed in a house that so rarely saw her, was among the first people Maya called, once the foundation began taking shape, offering her a position overseeing staff welfare programs for every property the organization eventually partnered with. Ruth accepted without hesitation, telling Maya through tears over the phone that she had spent 30 years watching good, hardworking people get treated as though they were invisible, and that she finally felt as though someone with real power was choosing to see them. Together, the two women built training programs that taught household staff their legal rights, established a confidential hotline for workers facing harassment or abuse in private homes, and funded emergency housing for anyone who needed to leave an unsafe employer without fear of losing their income entirely. What had once been a quiet, private promise between two women in a pantry became, within a year, a structure capable of protecting thousands of people neither of them would ever personally meet. Maya, in contrast, found her name spoken with an entirely different kind of weight as the months passed. The foundation grew faster than anyone at Daniel's firm had initially projected, expanding within its first year to support workers across a dozen cities, funding legal assistance for employees facing workplace discrimination, establishing scholarship programs for people trying to build lives beyond the service industry the way Maya herself once had. She spoke at conferences she never could have imagined, attending as a maid, standing quietly against a ballroom wall, and each time she told her story plainly, without exaggeration or self-pity, simply as a fact of her life that had led her, eventually, somewhere better. Several months after the engagement party that had briefly made her the subject of headlines across the country, Maya stood on a small stage at a charity gala organized entirely by her own foundation, her hair grown back into a short, natural crop that framed her face, in a way she had grown to genuinely love. The scar near her hairline had faded to something barely visible, a thin, pale line she sometimes forgot was even there, until someone asked about it directly. As she stepped up to the podium to address the room, applause rose from an audience that included several people who had once stood frozen and silent in that other ballroom, watching her kneel on the floor and do nothing to help her. This time, when she looked out over the crowd, she was met not with indifference, but with genuine respect, and somewhere near the back of the room, seated quietly among the other guests, rather than standing at the front demanding attention, Daniel Whitfield watched her speak with an expression of quiet, unmistakable pride. There was no dramatic declaration between them that night, no announcement of romance staged for cameras or headlines, because neither of them needed anything so loud to understand what had grown steadily between them over the months since that terrible evening. It was simply there, in the way he watched her finish her speech, in the small, private smile that passed between them as she stepped down from the stage and crossed the room toward him, in the easy comfort of two people who had built something real out of gratitude, patience, and years of quiet respect. Neither of them had ever expected to receive so completely from another person. Whatever came next for them, it would be built on a foundation entirely different from the one that had defined Maya's years at the Sinclair estate, a foundation made of choice rather than obligation, of mutual regard rather than careless command. In the end, what people remembered most about that night was not simply the cruelty of a single moment, however shocking, but the lesson that moment eventually taught an entire city watching from a distance. A person can be stripped of her hair in a matter of seconds, dragged across a marble floor in front of hundreds of witnesses, too cowardly or too comfortable to intervene, humiliated in the most public way. One human being can humiliate another. But dignity, real dignity, the kind built quietly over years of showing up, of keeping promises, of refusing to let cruelty define who you become, cannot be cut away with a pair of borrowed scissors, no matter how sharp the blade or how loud the audience watching in silence. Maya walked out of that house, having lost nothing that truly mattered, and Sophia, for all her wealth and all her power, in that single terrible moment, walked away, having lost nearly everything that did.